My name is Arthur. I am 32 years old, and I can still feel the freezing marble floor of my father's corporate office pressing against my knees. I was 22, desperately gathering the scattered pages of a business plan he had just slapped out of my hands. My heart pounded so hard I thought I would choke. I looked up at him, searching for a shred of paternal warmth in his icy eyes, but found only absolute contempt. He adjusted his silk tie, looked down at me as if I were a piece of garbage, and delivered the words that shattered my universe. "You are weak. You are a failure. And as of this moment, you are not my son," my wealthy dad said. Before I could process the devastation, security guards grabbed my arms, dragging me out and tossing me onto the freezing pavement with nothing but the clothes on my back. I lay there convinced my life was over. But what he didn't know was that exactly 10 years later, the tables would turn in a terrifying way. Before I dive into exactly how we reached that horrifying nightmare and what happened a decade later to flip our worlds upside down, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening to this story from? I always love knowing which state or city my words are reaching, because it reminds me that we are all connected by these raw, shared human experiences. Just drop your city in the comments. I really appreciate it. Anyway, to truly understand the sheer weight of that betrayal, you need to know the toxic environment I grew up in. I wasn't just some rebellious, ungrateful kid looking for a fight. I was a son who spent his entire childhood twisting himself into knots, trying to earn a single nod of approval from a man whose heart was entirely consumed by greed. My father, Richard, who is now 60 years old, was a titan in the commercial real estate market here in the United States. He built his empire from the ground up, and he never let anyone forget it. Our house wasn't a home, it was a museum of his ego. Everything had to be perfect, pristine, and profitable. If you weren't adding to his bottom line or his social status, you were a liability. Growing up, I quickly realized that his love was strictly conditional. It wasn't about who you were as a person, but about what kind of trophy you could be for him to show off to his billionaire friends at country club dinners. If I got an A- on a math test, he wouldn't speak to me for a week. The silence was his weapon of choice, a psychological torture that made me feel entirely invisible in my own house. My younger sister, Eleanor, who is now 29 years old, figured out the game much faster than I did. She learned to mirror his ruthless behavior, becoming his little golden child. While I was in my room reading about sustainable agriculture and community development, she was at the dinner table regurgitating his talking points about hostile takeovers and crushing the competition. I didn't hate her for it. I actually pitied her. She had traded her soul for his conditional affection. But for me, the breaking point was always going to come. I couldn't fake it. Every time he dragged me to one of his construction sites and bragged about displacing low-income families to build luxury condos, my stomach would violently churn. I felt completely suffocated by the greed that coated every surface of our lives. The real fracture happened when I was in my final year of college. He had already mapped out my entire life. I was supposed to graduate, step into an executive role at his firm, marry someone from an equally wealthy family, and continue his legacy of corporate ruthlessness. But I had a different dream. I had been secretly spending all my free time and allowance volunteering at urban farms and drafting a comprehensive business plan for a nonprofit cooperative that would bring fresh, affordable produce to food deserts in our city. It was something I was genuinely passionate about. I wanted to build things that helped people, not tear down neighborhoods to build monuments to wealth. I knew telling him would be bad, but I naively believed that maybe, just maybe, seeing my dedication would spark a tiny bit of respect. I spent weeks perfecting the proposal. I bound it in leather, rehearsed my pitch until my throat was raw, and finally gathered the courage to confront him in his downtown office. That brings us back to that horrible Tuesday morning. I walked into his suite, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the folder. I laid it out in front of him, explaining how this project could even be a positive PR move for his company if he backed it as a philanthropic venture. He didn't even read past the first page. He saw the words nonprofit and community, and his face contorted into a mask of pure disgust. That was when he slapped the folder out of my hands, sending the pages flying across the marble floor like dead leaves. The memory of the security guards manhandling me out of the lobby still haunts my nightmares. They didn't just escort me, they threw me out like I was a violent trespasser. I hit the wet concrete, scraping my palms, as the heavy glass doors locked behind me. My father had immediately frozen all my bank accounts and canceled my phone plan. Within an hour, I went from being the heir to a multi-million-dollar empire to a homeless 22-year-old wandering the streets in a tailored suit. The panic that set in was indescribable. It felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the world. I sat on a bus bench as the rain soaked through my clothes, violently shivering, trying to process the fact that the man who was supposed to protect me had just erased me from existence without a second thought. The first few nights were a living hell. I slept behind a dumpster near a diner because the exhaust vent blew warm air. I was terrified, jumping at every shadow, clutching my empty pockets. Hunger starts as an ache and quickly turns into a blinding desperation that clouds all rational thought. On the third day, I walked into the back entrance of a dingy diner on the outskirts of the city. That is where I met Marcus, a 35-year-old kitchen manager with a stern face but kind eyes. I begged him for any kind of work, offering to clean the toilets just for a hot meal. Marcus looked at my ruined suit, saw the absolute despair in my eyes, and handed me an apron without asking a single question. For the next 3 years, my reality was a relentless blur of scalding water, grease burns, and bone-crushing exhaustion. I washed dishes for 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The physical pain in my back and hands was excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the mental anguish. There were nights I would sit on my lumpy mattress in the tiny, roach-infested studio apartment I rented with Marcus's help, and I would just sob uncontrollably into my hands. I felt like such a massive failure. The voices in my head, sounding exactly like my father, constantly whispered that I was worthless, that I had thrown away a perfect life for a stupid, naive dream. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed just to wake up and face the sink again the next morning. But in that kitchen, I found something I never had in my father's mansion, a genuine community. Marcus became the big brother I never had. We would talk during our breaks, and I finally opened up about my past. Instead of laughing at my farming dream, Marcus encouraged it. He told me that resilience wasn't about never falling, but refusing to stay on the ground. Every dollar I didn't spend on cheap noodles and rent went into a rusty metal lockbox under my bed. I started reading business books from the library during my commute on the bus. I was determined to prove my father wrong, not by becoming a ruthless monster like him, but by succeeding on my own terms, with my humanity completely intact. Year 4 was the turning point. I had saved enough to buy a small, abandoned plot of dirt in a rundown neighborhood. It was filled with trash and broken glass, but to me, it was the most beautiful piece of real estate in the world. On my one day off a week, I was out there clearing debris by hand, my muscles screaming in protest. Neighbors started noticing. Slowly, people began to stop by, offering a pair of gloves or a few hours of labor. We planted the first seeds together. It was grueling, unglamorous work. My hands were permanently calloused and stained with soil, a stark contrast to the manicured nails of my past life. But for the first time in my existence, I felt a deep, profound sense of purpose that no amount of money could ever buy. The farm slowly blossomed into a small cooperative market. We provided fresh, organic food to a community that had been ignored by major grocery chains for decades. The local news did a small segment on us, which led to a modest grant, which led to buying an adjacent abandoned warehouse to expand operations. By year 7, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. My business model, which focused on community reinvestment rather than extracting every cent of profit, proved to be incredibly sustainable. We opened a second location, then a third. I was working 80-hour weeks, but the exhaustion was sweet. I had built a family of employees and partners who respected me for my character, not for my last name or my bank account balance. During all this time, I completely blocked out any news about my father. I changed my number, avoided his circles, and focused entirely on my own healing. I knew from brief conversations with Marcus that my sister Eleanor had climbed the ranks to become my father's right-hand woman, embracing his cutthroat tactics. They were building bigger, riskier developments, leveraging massive debt to finance luxury megaprojects that no one actually needed. I felt a brief pang of sorrow for Eleanor, knowing she was trapped in that cycle, but I had to protect my peace. I couldn't let their dark cloud overshadow the bright world I was building from the dirt up. Then came year 10. The economy shifted drastically. A major commercial real estate bubble burst, and the exact kind of high-risk, debt-heavy luxury projects my father specialized in became absolute poison. I didn't know the specifics at first. I was sitting in my modest office above our flagship cooperative market, reviewing expansion plans, when Marcus burst through the door holding a newspaper. His face was pale, and he looked at me with a mixture of shock and concern. He placed the paper on my desk. The headline screamed in bold black letters, "Richard's real estate empire collapses. Billionaire faces ruin amid massive fraud investigation." My stomach performed a violent flip. Seeing his name, seeing his empire crumbling in print, sent a shockwave through my entire nervous system. I read the article with my breath caught in my throat. My father had over-leveraged his entire portfolio. When the market dipped, his creditors called in their loans, and he didn't have the cash. Worse, the investigation revealed he had been illegally shifting funds from employee pension accounts to cover his massive debts. The man who had called me a failure, who had tossed me into the streets for wanting to help people, was now being exposed as a desperate criminal. The article mentioned that his board of directors had ousted him and that his assets were being seized by the federal government. Even his golden child, my sister Eleanor, had publicly distanced herself, resigning from the company and fleeing to Europe with whatever offshore money she could salvage, leaving him to face the music completely alone. The emotions that hit me were violently complicated. A dark, ugly part of me wanted to scream in victory, to pop a bottle of champagne and celebrate his destruction. It felt like cosmic karma, a divine retribution for the cruelty he had inflicted, not just on me, but on thousands of people throughout his career. But beneath that vindictive urge was a deep, hollow sadness. He was still my father. I remembered being a little boy, desperately hoping he would just push me on the swings or read me a bedtime story. The realization that he had destroyed his own life, alienated his children, and ended up entirely isolated in his old age was a profound tragedy. I sat in my office for hours after Marcus left, staring at the wall, feeling completely numb. 2 weeks passed. The news cycle moved on, but the reality of his downfall hung heavily over me. I was closing up the main market late one rainy Tuesday night. The streets were slick and dark, reflecting the glow of the streetlights. I was locking the heavy glass doors when I saw a figure standing under the awning across the street, shivering in the cold, damp air. The silhouette was hunched, defeated, lacking all the arrogant posture I remembered. As the man slowly stepped into the light, my heart stopped completely. It was him, Richard, my father. But he looked like a ghost of the titan he used to be. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting trench coat that was soaked through at the shoulders. His normally immaculate silver hair was wildly overgrown and plastered to his forehead. The expensive Italian leather shoes he always wore were replaced by scuffed, generic loafers. He looked incredibly old, fragile, and utterly broken. As he slowly crossed the empty street toward me, every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get in my car and drive away before he could infect my life again. My hands were visibly shaking as I gripped my keys. The sheer trauma of that day in his office came rushing back. The phantom feeling of the security guards grabbing my arms making my muscles tense up in pure defensive panic. He stopped a few feet away from me. The silence between us was heavier than a concrete block. He looked at the glowing sign of my cooperative market, then down at my work boots. And finally, he met my eyes. The icy blue arrogance that had defined his gaze for decades was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, hollow fear. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. And when he finally spoke, his voice was a raspy, fragile whisper that barely cut through the sound of the falling rain. "Arthur," he said, his voice trembling violently. I have nowhere else to go. They took everything. The houses, the accounts, the cars. Eleanor won't even answer my calls. I am sleeping in a shelter, Arthur. Please. Hearing the man who had terrorized my entire childhood beg for my help was a surreal, out-of-body experience. 10 years ago, I would have given anything, absolutely anything, to hear him speak my name with even a fraction of this vulnerability. But now, it just felt pathetic. A surge of righteous anger bubbled up from the deepest pit of my stomach. I looked at him, shivering in the cold, and the memory of my own freezing night on the pavement flashed brightly in my mind. I remembered the blinding hunger, the terrifying vulnerability of sleeping behind a dumpster, the agonizing feeling of being discarded like trash by the only family I had. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to control the massive storm of emotions raging inside my chest. "You have nowhere to go?" I asked, my voice steady and cold, a stark contrast to the trembling boy he had thrown out a decade prior. "That is a tragedy, Richard. It truly is. But what exactly do you expect from me?" He flinched at the use of his first name. He reached out a trembling hand, stepping slightly closer. "You are my son, Arthur. You're my blood. I know I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. I was too harsh. But family is supposed to help each other in times of crisis. I just need a place to stay, a small loan to get back on my feet. I see you've done well for yourself here. You can afford to help your old man. We can rebuild together. I have the knowledge, you have the capital." Even in his absolute ruin, the transactional nature of his mind couldn't be turned off. The sheer audacity of his request left me speechless. He didn't want redemption. He wanted a bailout. He saw my business not as an achievement, but as an ATM to fund his impossible comeback. A cold clarity washed over me. The terrified little boy inside me, who always craved his father's love, finally died in that exact moment, leaving behind a grown man who knew his own worth. I looked him dead in the eyes, refusing to break contact. "Family?" I echoed, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "You lost the right to use that word 10 years ago. You didn't make a mistake, Richard. You made a calculated choice to destroy me because I didn't fit into your spreadsheet." I watched the desperation in his eyes curdle into a brief flash of his old anger, but he was too weak to sustain it. His shoulders slumped further. "Arthur, please," he whimpered, tears mixing with the rain on his wrinkled cheeks. "I will die out here on the streets. You can't just leave me to die." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my wallet. I took out a $50 bill and held it out to him. "There is a motel 3 blocks down the avenue. This will cover one night and a hot meal at the diner next door. The manager there is named Marcus. If you are willing to scrub toilets and wash dishes for 14 hours a day without complaining, he might give you a job. That is exactly how I started when you left me to die." He stared at the $50 bill in my hand as if it were a venomous snake. His pride, the only thing he had left, warred visibly with his survival instinct. His hand shook violently as he slowly reached out and took the money from my grasp. He didn't say thank you. He didn't apologize again. He just clutched the damp bill, turned his back, and began slowly shuffling down the dark, wet street toward the motel. I stood there under the awning for a long time, watching his silhouette disappear into the foggy night. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel triumphant. But as I turned the key in the lock of my thriving business, a profound, unshakable sense of peace settled heavily over my soul. The heavy chains of my past had finally completely shattered. The greatest lesson I learned from this agonizing journey is that true wealth has nothing to do with money, and biological ties do not guarantee a family. I had to lose the toxic father I was given to build the beautiful life and chosen family I truly deserved. Forgiving him didn't mean saving him from the consequences of his actions. It meant freeing myself from his expectations. Now, I want to hear from you. If you were in my exact position, standing in the rain with the person who destroyed your youth begging for help, would you do the same thing, or would you have reacted differently? Let me know your honest thoughts down in the comments. Until the next story.